To kick off our day, I think there's nobody better but our own Dr. Freudenreich, who really has been in the trenches of community psychiatry for his whole career and is, my co-director, the co-director of the schizophrenia program at Mass General.
Good. Thank you, Daphne. Well, hold your horses. You don't know what I'm going to say, so. I don't have the slides here, so every now and then I have to look up there, okay? So that, just warning you. But you have the slides in front of you as well, so follow along and make notes. I'm going to speak about community psychiatry progress and challenges. And I try to give you both views, a somewhat realistic view of problems, because there are problems, and at the same time also a cautiously optimistic view that we actually have made progress. And certainly I believe understanding the past helps us tremendously moving forward in the right direction. This is the kind of talk I'm old enough now I can give, because I have been in public community psychiatry for almost 30 years, believe it or not. 20 years of those here in Massachusetts, but I've also experienced public community psychiatry in other settings, in other states, and in another country. So some of the things that I'm going to be reflecting on are a little bit personal. You'll see, and hopefully this initial talk that I put together lays the framework a little bit for what Daphne is going to follow up on, what she's actually doing to improve care, and then in the afternoon with Corey and her team. So let's see, I think I can do this by myself. You saw my disclosures. I put them in there just to make you aware that I do a lot of things, including clinical drug trials. I don't think this has shaped in any way what I'm going to say at this moment, but in the interest of disclosure. So I'm going to really talk about I'm going to break up my talk in three different sections. You can look at the learning objectives, but I'm going to just look at the outline here. Going to look at the last century. It's really the briefest of brief histories, and then I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the last 2 decades, lessons learned, and I'm going to try and put it together looking at the next decade, how we can meaningfully take the things that we learned to really move forward. So this is an experiment I always do with residents, so humor me and really just spend 30 seconds to think about the following. And you can just do it mentally, you don't have to write it down. If you, and this is without thinking now, it's what comes to mind. If you hear asylum, okay, what comes to mind? Thank you. Just shout it out.
No choice, being cared for.
Good, thank you. Now, all of these terms are very negative. Negative connotation. I just want to say I am not from this country. You might have noticed my accent is not a fake Brooklyn accent, okay? It's not a Bostonian accent for those of you not from Boston. It's a German accent. When I came to this country, I'd never watched One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It was the first thing somebody mentioned. For me, asylum actually means a place from which you cannot be expelled. I have a very positive connotation to the word asylum. It is striking to me how words take on particular meanings, and that influences greatly, what we actually, down the road, what we might actually do with asylum-like buildings and institutions because of the connotation alone. Conversely, community, what comes to mind? Yeah. Yeah, you get the point. 2 different concepts, 2 different words, fundamentally different connotations. And I wonder if we get this right, just based on this little exercise, and maybe we can find a way to figure out a way to be more realistic about both terms. I'll come back to this slide, if you will. Now here, what do you notice? What do you notice? This is me in the 90s, right? You notice same poorly dressed, color scheme. You notice my hairstyle, if anything, has deteriorated. This is Butner, North Carolina. This was my first stop in the United States when I came. training and research. It was actually an incredible research facility in addition to taking care of patients. It was co-administered by Duke University. It was an academic center that worked in the state hospital system, providing high-quality care, doing research together also with neurology and internal medicine. Has since been dismantled, this system. This is when I started. Now you might also notice here I'm on a smoke break, I guess. You see a little bin there? So things have changed. There's no longer, at least not easily smoking. So what's the point here? The point is that our field stems from asylum care. We started out in the asylums. Psychiatry is fundamentally, in its origins, an asylum-based medical specialty, which makes us unique. No other specialty started out like that. And initially, it was a really good idea, because at some point during Enlightenment, people said, we need to take care of people who need our help. We need to provide asylums for them. Asylum from a cruel world out there, where they are, put away in prisons, left in the streets. And of course, you know what happened. Good ideas get often perverted. We have the overcrowding, and the institutions that started as a perhaps good idea with Enlightenment principles in mind became overcrowded institutions to the point, as I think you said it, the snake pits, the one flew over the cuckoo's nest type of things that we associate with them today. There has been a backlash. We started out in institutions, and in the 60s, it's a time of social upheaval and changes. We have something that's often subsumed under so-called antipsychiatry. And I think this is a very unfortunate term. I believe, for example, that in psychiatry, we are much farther ahead when it comes to human rights compared to the rest of medicine. And you might laugh now and think, how can that be? Here's somebody who puts people away, commits people to state institutions. But we always had to deal with it. Medicine, surgery, people just sign whatever is put in front. Nobody ever questions what's happening on the medical side. And if there's a question, guess who gets called? Psychiatry gets called to mediate these issues. So I do believe for better or worse, we always had oversight. And that in the end, it has been for the better for a specialty to actually have some societal oversight. So I don't like the term antipsychiatry because I think these were reform efforts often by very well-meaning people, including psychiatrists, not always psychiatrists, who really pointed out the deficits that we had in our asylum-based treatment system. Irving Goffman, for example, in his book Asylum, he's a sociologist, pointed out that there's a price that you pay if you're in what he called a total institution. Total institutions are those settings where you check in and then you're taken care of in your totality. People consider the military, for example, a total institution. Prisons are a total institution. I always tell my children, family is a total institution. What I say happens. That was in the 60s. And Thomas Szasz often, the myth of mental illness, you either love him or you hate him. But he did point out there is, in medicine, not just in psychiatry, there's an aspect of labeling. We have to agree on certain terms, and yet we actually do vote whether homosexuality is a disease or not. And these things do change, but not just in psychiatry, also in medicine. You might have seen that obesity, fairly recently within the last few years, was actually voted. How else are you going to decide on it, right? To be included as a disease, as opposed to not. So the idea of determining what counts as a disease or not is a fundamentally social process, and we are not an exception here. But of course, because of civil rights issues, we've always been perhaps more exposed to criticism than the rest of medicine. In Italy, there was a very famous psychiatrist who basically managed in the late 70s to pass a law that there would be no institution-based care anymore. So more or less, Italy really does not have any state hospitals because of this law. I put one example from my own country here. Germany in the 70s was a few years before before I was in medical school there, but this is from my alma mater, Heidelberg University, where there was a period of a few months where patients and their psychiatrist occupied the university, and they demanded change. They wanted to have open wards, they wanted to have outpatient care, and this effort was squashed by the state. The German government very heavy-handedly squashed this effort. And yet, this is in German history a very important moment, because for the first time, patients themselves wanted to have a voice. In state hospitals, no patient used to have a voice. You know, I said it's a total institution. You show up there, and you behave the way you are told with all the rules and regulations. So these are just a few examples of these efforts to do better. And I think you're doing these pioneers a disservice by putting them into the anti-psychiatry category. I think that is not helpful. And as a result of these reform efforts, we have, for better or worse, we have, for example, the Eric Lindemann Mental Health Center. Might have seen it in the news. Part of this section is actually on the market now. The state, I guess, tries to sell it. The good and the bad news is, the good news is the Lindemann is not part of this bid. That's also the bad news for some people. So in 1971, this community mental health center opened. That was in response to an effort to close the state hospitals to provide care in the community. You know, Kennedy's Mental Health Act, 63, I want to say, it was signed. So this was an outgrowth of that. So everything I'm telling you is you're going to basically saying that's great, right? We recognize total institutions are not good, you know, even though they were started with good intentions. We're going to move everything in the community. We're going to build these beautiful mental health centers, and everybody's going to get full spectrum of care in the community. And this just summarizes, you know, the asylum-based beginnings with 2 German-speaking psychiatrists and the state hospital in Europe. This one is in Massachusetts. Recognize which one this is? Worcester, I think it is, right? Took it off the internet a long time ago, so I kind of lost track which one it is. And then we have this problem, okay? That we have many patients with serious mental disorders who live in the streets today, or in prison, and who are not getting cared for in the community in a meaningful way. So, to be blunt about it, there are some unpleasant facts that we face today. That deinstitutionalization, as this movement into the community has been called, I wouldn't call it a failure, although some people will call it a failure. I would say, at a minimum, it failed many and continues to fail many. Some people have said, we never deinstitutionalized people. We just dehospitalized the hospitals. We got them out of the hospitals. We certainly today would agree that we trans-institutionalized people. We put people from state facilities into prisons. I mean, if you follow the news, even you know, peripherally, you recognize that many of our patients today, instead of going to a hospital, are brought to the you know, the prison system at some point. And very disturbingly, health disparities persist. I'm not going to review this in great details, other to point out that there's a mortality gap. If you have a serious mental illness, depending which study you look at, you lose a decade of life on average, simply because you have a serious mental illness compared to those who don't. Access to care, I mean, this is a group of people here, you at some point, whether you're a patient or you have a lived experience or a family member, I would be shocked if you have not encountered this issue of access to care or access to good and high quality care. And Paul Farmer has always pointed out, I like to say this, that the way I talk about this, you should recognize that it really matters how we put our healthcare system together, that social interventions have a really important, great impact on how you do with the disease, short of a cure. I always take a cure over management, okay? But for those diseases where we don't have a cure, we need research to work towards that goal. But in the interim, people who live today, we need to have good healthcare systems that manage the illness competently, and help people to live lives to the fullest of possibilities, not in a state institution, not in the streets, not in prison, but in the communities. So as an aspirational goal, I think that the trajectory is pretty clear. So this sounded pretty negative now, but I do think we need to also be hard-nosed a little bit and realistic about what the challenges are. On the other hand, I have, this is here my little pin that I got the other day, the 2 stars. So I've been there for 20 years, 1 star, you know, not for winning the World Cup, but for Germany won it actually more than twice, the soccer team. So the US would be 0 wins. So 20 years. So I reflected a little bit and thought about, you know, what are the lessons that I actually did learn about this? History matters. I'll come back to that point. I think I already outlined this a little bit. Inclusion matters. I think that's part of also what the antipsychiatrists pointed out. You know, we cannot just make decisions for people with illnesses. They need to be involved and engaged in these discussions. And Dr. Cather is going to provide a very good concrete example in the afternoon what that actually means. Recovery matters, and we can discuss, you know, what recovery means. Recovery at a very basic level, to my mind, means being accepted as a citizen and partaking in society and being taken seriously when you say something. And in the afternoon, it's really also dedicated to know how to best do this. Prevention, Daphne is going to talk about, because I think that has been a very encouraging development in our field. Started really almost a little bit more than a decade ago when we started, amongst others in the country, a first episode program just to begin to think about the beginning of illnesses. But Daphne is actually trying to move this much, much earlier with the idea that, I mean, the best disease is the one that you never get, right? The one that you prevent. So I think it's really important to lose sight of that. But there's other aspects to prevention, and that is medical prevention. The idea that, you know, if you have schizophrenia, for example, and you die at age 45 from cardiovascular disease, sorry to use technical medical language, that's a bad outcome. We have failed. We've failed. So, in my lifetime, you saw me here at the Butner State Hospital next to a bin with smoking. In my lifetime, that has fundamentally changed how we view the need for medical care for patients with serious mental illnesses, and smoking is one part of that. When I trained, smoke breaks was pretty much, everything was centered around smoke breaks. Every single aspect of being in a hospital. Now, thank God that has changed, and now there's attempts to help people quit smoking, you know, if you come to the hospital smoking. If I ask my older patients, you know, in the 50s and 60s, I'm in that age group, but okay, that didn't sound right. When they started smoking, well, quite a few actually started smoking during their first hospitalization because there was a smoke break. So that really has fundamentally changed. And then I'm going to have one last slide towards the very end. Why systems matter. I think you can already guess that it really does matter how we set up our system. Give you a few just snapshots of, I think, what we have learned. You know, shared decision making. That term didn't exist when I was in medical school. And this is actually from some colleagues in Germany who point out there not all decisions are equal. And we really need to think very hard. You know, when is it really up to the patient to decide? And I believe more often than not, it's really just up to the patient and not what I want or what society wants. Now, there are some decisions, this is the life and death decisions, that I believe society has given me the responsibility to do something and not just let a bad outcome happen. But my concern is often that very easily and all too easily we move into this, oh, this is a life or death decision, as opposed to looking perhaps in the middle, a best choice decision, which is the fact that I think the best thing would be to go to the hospital. But there might be people who have different opinions about that. And it's tough. It's tough because there's many stakeholders, and there can always be made the case easily, well, something could go wrong. And in this particular society that we live in, it's a tough thing. All I want to point out that not all decisions are equal, and as a field, working together, we really need to make sure we're not just automatically moving into the most serious direction, which it's a life or death decision, and we'll decide without patients or families having a voice. It's been very clear. When I started out my training, it was all about the symptoms. We switched medicines, and always was how are your voices? This question. It's pretty clear today that what matters fundamentally, and I'm not saying that if somebody is experiencing distressing voices and has thoughts that are disturbing, that it doesn't matter. But once this is more or less under control, it's negative symptoms, the lack of initiative, for example, and cognitive difficulties, difficulties remembering things, difficulty with, organizing things in a way that leads to a desired outcome. So it's very clear how the field has shifted to not looking just at the symptoms in a very narrow way, but much more broadly. And the whole effort in prevention, for example, is really at the level of looking at these other symptoms that get in the way then. If you have no motivation, it's really, really hard to succeed. And that is part and parcel and the core of many of the more serious disorders that people struggle with. So that's the idea of that the functional outcome is really not just determined by hallucinations, as one example. And in addition to this, increasingly, and I think psychiatry has actually been at the leading edge there as well in an interesting way, is the idea that quality of life matters. And I don't get this wrong now, and I'm doing tape, but there's more to life than death. Sometimes, and oncology perhaps is a more clear example. I think oncology is starting to see now that some people will be better off with less treatment. Given the time that they have, and people get involved, in these discussions with their oncologists in a good system. In psychiatry, I think it is rather clear that for those of you who actually have to take medicines, that they don't solve all your problems. They don't give people jobs, certain problems that the illness is associated with, illness like schizophrenia that I mentioned, negative symptoms and cognitive problems, are not really targeted that well or treated by the medicines that we have. So sometimes less is more, If you give somebody a medicine that's sedating and they sleep all day, that's probably, for the person who has to take the medicine, is from my perspective, is not a good clinical outcome. It's not what I look for, when I prescribe medicines. So it's this finding the right balance and really a focus, not just on symptoms, not even on function, but quality of life. Do people actually feel okay when they take these medicines? Prevention, gonna skip it other to point out that prevention is not just one big monolithic thing. There's actually many different aspects of prevention that we can give terms like primary, secondary, and tertiary. I don't want to go over this, other to point out that a lot of things that I do, even in people who have had 5 hospitalizations, I'm actually in prevention as well. Since I try to prevent the sixth time that somebody goes to the hospital. It's an example of tertiary prevention. And I would argue that as a field, and while you're nodding, you also should be shaking your head, this is the most important thing for psychiatrists, to do that piece well for those people who have the illness. The tertiary prevention, to make sure it does not get worse over time. But medicine alone will not do this. We need a whole system, we need society to help us with this. And medical prevention I alluded to. To make it concrete, this is my children's harmonica. But I used to have a patient who came to clinic, our clozapine clinic, that we do together with in a community mental health center, the Freudenreich Clinic with North Suffolk Mental Health Association, came to clinic once a month, and we knew he was in clinic because he played the harmonica. He wasn't very good. He only knew one song, but he was a jovial guy, and we always liked to hear the harmonica, until one day the music died when he had a heart attack in his early 50s. So, looking actually, this was Dave Henderson did this when he was our previous boss. He looked at the clozapine clinic, people taking clozapine, and this is now 20 years ago, and all he did was look over 5 years how many people developed diabetes in this group of patients. It was 30%, okay? That sounds, you have no comparison group here, so maybe, every large group of people, here, 5 years, 30% will develop diabetes. I don't think that's the case. I know it's not the case. So it is in part due to clozapine, but also the lives that people with serious mental illness are forced to live. In group homes, and there are good group homes too. I'm just using this generically. In group homes where the food is just not what I'm looking for, in order to not get diabetes. Let's just say that. We looked at the same cohort, the clozapine-treated patient, about 200 here, and we found that you see it doesn't go to. See it from here. Sorry, I have to look like this. It's about 70% or so of people are either current smokers or used to smoke, and only a third never smoked. In Massachusetts, do you know the smoking rate? It's under 20%. So this is not good. And it's, of course, an incredible risk factor for all kinds of cardiovascular disease, for heart attacks, lung cancer. So it's a really important, for a treatment system, I believe, a really important aspect of taking care of people with serious illness. And the World Health Organization actually just last year, for the first time, published something, and if it makes its way through the institutions to end up as a World Health Organization publication, that means it's really serious, and a lot of people have pushed very hard to get it there. They made some recommendations beyond just monitoring. For example, what I showed you in the clozapine clinic, we just monitored and looked who develops diabetes. We need to do something, and this is really a call for action worldwide, not just in the United States, to really take the physical health monitoring for people with serious illnesses, serious mental illnesses, seriously, and start to do something so we can reduce this mortality gap, as it's been called. Now, how can we put all of this together? This is my favorite philosopher because he's from my hometown of Stuttgart, Hegel. Unreadable in both English and in German, okay? So I dumb it down to 3 things that he never said, by the way. It's mistakenly attributed to him, okay? This idea that the thesis, there's an antithesis or antithesis, that's the opposite of the first thesis, and then you end up with a synthesis. It's a way of thinking about problems, okay? You go from here, what about this? And then you kind of combine those things. And the thesis is a little bit that community psychiatry will solve all problems. That was the hope in the 60s, truthfully. I think people were very bright-eyed and bushy-tailed about it. The antithesis, or the antithesis, is that community psychiatry has failed. And I gave you some examples that it does look bleak, if you look at certain ways of thinking about it. I want to say, though, that today the recognition really is, it's not either or. That community psychiatry is critical in any system of care. It's a really important part, but it's not the only part. There's a whole care system. And here's the problem. This is the so-called public health pyramid. Psychiatry, myself, when I prescribe medicines, I work at the top of this pyramid, clinical care. The bottom of the pyramid are social determinants of health. If you live in poverty, if you have access to clean water, if you live in a war zone, all those things that matter greatly for your life. And of course, in a society and in patients' lives, you have the biggest impact, including for prevention, working at the bottom of this pyramid. So we really, as a society, need to focus on this, but we can never forget to do the best possible at the top of the pyramid as well. And I say this because sometimes you see a shift that, towards earlier and earlier disease stages at the expense of forgetting, well, there are actually people who have had this illness for 20 years. Are we just going to ignore them? And I'm just feel very strongly that in a good system of care, the whole pyramid needs to be addressed, including actually providing competent care at the top, even if it's specialty care. I say this because sometimes I see a little bit of a tension between community care and specialty care. Now, this graph I should not draw like this. So this is the Schizophrenia Clinical Research Program. I want to highlight again, as I said earlier a little bit, we are not in this by ourselves. We have a community partner, North Suffolk Mental Health Association. You see here the little acronym or the abbreviation. They run the Freedom Trail Clinic, where I see patients. They have a very large network of other clinics, of group homes, and they are the ones in the trenches, not me. I'm sitting there in my office. I actually look at the State House. I'm at the top of the pyramid. Okay? There's only so much I can do. I think I'm important, because if you need clozapine, you want to get it from me. Probably. Because I think about these things, including how can I prescribe it safely, so that we avoid that somebody develops diabetes while they take clozapine as one example. But what's wrong with this picture is that I put the Schizophrenia Clinical Research Program in the middle here, with all the components. It's all exciting, it's all important. But in the end, that's the top of the pyramid. That should be the small piece. The other pieces on the right side, the community, is actually the large piece. The trick is, I think, to collaborate effectively with the community side, including research, so that both sides get the best of both worlds, if you will. In a free society, I want people to decide freely about their lives, with or without psychiatric illness, where they want to live, what kind of life they want to have in a community. And I want that people have this opportunity. At the same time, if somebody needs psychiatric care, that should be offered, at the tertiary care level, if you will, with the highest competence. So it's a give and take, and I put some other programs here just to show you that we're really interested in this med-psych integration. Dr. Irwin, who had spoken here a few years ago, for example, is very interested how to bring cancer care from the cancer center into the communities for people with serious mental illness. So there's a lot of efforts at this point to try and really bridge and combine these two approaches that are not mutually exclusive. They're actually, in the end, what is needed to effectively manage conditions that need to be managed because we don't have a cure at this point in time. And in an interesting way, I just put this there, the more things change. There was an article in a very prominent medical journal called JAMA, Improving Long-Term Psychiatric Care, Bring Back the Asylum. Whoa. But he talks about the asylum the way I defined asylum, as a place from which you cannot be expelled. So, because in clear recognition that we have lost this function of a treatment system. So, this thought experiment that I had you do at the beginning, what comes to mind when I say asylum, what comes to mind when I say community? It's a false dichotomy. It should not be put on different sides. That's the Hegelian view. You've got to bring this together. There needs to be a continuum of care. And care needs to happen, there's no question about it, it needs to happen in the community to the extent possible. And that means that the communities get the support that they need to actually do their job. So if somebody needs to have a community outreach worker, there needs to be somebody qualified to do this and talk about access to care. Somebody needs to be able to sign up for this service. At this point, if you ask me, and I want to use Massachusetts as an example, let's just use the United States in general, we don't have enough outreach programs that people can sign up for to receive the level of care in the community that they need, the level of supervision that they need. It's a little bit, I think it's important to recognize this. Being in the community, left on your own devices, is often not the goal. It's not going to work. Those are the people who end up in shelters. The key is to be in the community at a level that makes sense. There's a small group of patients where the asylum, a state hospital, will still be needed at this point in time. I think as a field, we have failed, for example, to make sure that people, if they need a psychiatric hospitalization, can get one for medical reasons for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks. It's extremely difficult to get somebody into a hospital for a psychiatric illness unless there's some sort of dangerousness. And often, as you know, I see people nodding, people get discharged after 3 days. That's not a meaningful use, the way I see it here when I talk about the continuum of care. Access to high-quality care, I mentioned this idea of supporting people, whatever else it is in this continuum of care, and the access to asylum. I put a Latin phrase at the bottom, mens sana in societate sana. A healthy, let's say person here, a healthy person in a healthy society. Usually we think a healthy person in a healthy mind and vice versa. There's actually also this idea, it really helps to live in a good society to accomplish all those goals. In the end, and that's the good and the bad news, I've been in this long enough just to say the system that we have today produces the results it produces because it's set up to produce these results. Okay, it's not set up in a way and we're surprised that these are the results. It's exactly what you would expect, with that amount of funding, with this structure. But the good news about this is, if we are thoughtful about this, and I gave you a little bit of historical view, we can get different results. If we think about how to change things. And I want to be optimistic because if we think year to year, we often feel we have made no progress at all. It's the same problems with access, with this and that. And yet I have to say, once you take the larger view, you step back, you think in 20 years, you start to see, and I try to give you conceptually some ideas, that we actually have come a long way. I would, despite everything, I'd rather be treated today than in the 60s in psychiatry. History matters. Today is November 9. That might not mean anything to you. I'm from West Germany. November 9, 1989, the wall came down. This is today. This was 30 years ago. So, the East German system was designed to produce the results that it produced, needing a wall so people wouldn't leave, and you would get shot if you tried to leave. Now, they said they wanted to prevent capitalism from coming into the socialist paradise. So, to me, and I didn't anticipate this. I was in the West German army. I thought East Germany was the enemy. This is going to be fixed. And it turned out to be not the case. So I am I'm open and cautiously optimistic that if we think about this together collectively, if people just work on small pieces of all of this, but with some broad principles in mind, that we want to have our patients as citizens, in an open, free society, I think we can do better than today. And I think that's what I want to leave you with. Thank you.